guys doing? You guys having an okay spring break? Yeah? Good. First class of the afternoon, right? You guys? Yeah. Very good. All right. Did you guys happen to catch the lecture this morning? Okay. Just make sure, Justin, just go back and watch that one if you get a chance. All right, folks, so we're just going to pick up where we left off this morning, talking about women's suffrage in Britain. And so the tail end of this morning's lecture, I was talking about the suffragettes who came largely from the middle class, the bourgeoisie. So they were wealthier, they had better educations, and they also had enough wealth where they were able to hire house sitters, nannies, to take care of their kids. And as such, they were able to then use their time to go out and do demonstrations or petitions or other things like that to make more people aware of the cause of women's suffrage, which is women getting the right to vote. And so, but remember that because they came from the middle class, there wasn't a whole lot of people from the working class that were drawn to their cause, because the working class largely looked at the middle class, whether or not they were conservatives or liberals. There was a class discrepancy where the working class very much didn't think that the middle class had a whole lot of real genuine interest in them. And so if women of the middle class were able to get the right to vote, for example, there was the potential that they would then not be looking out for women of the working class. So the suffragette movement stays largely more middle class, and then the suffragist movement is largely more working class. And they kind of worked towards their different goals independently. One of the better known women of the suffrage movement in Britain at this time was Millicent Garrett Fawcett. Millicent Garrett Fawcett was the leader of something called the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies. And basically this organization demanded that Parliament grant female suffrage, and she helped grow the suffrage movement and played a role in both national and international suffrage conferences, where she would go to other countries where women's suffrage was not yet put into law, and hold conferences where women would come and become more politically active, politically aware, and gain more of a following and more support for the suffrage movement. She's actually so successful that she ends up getting knighted in 1924, and it's pretty uncommon for women to get knighted at all. But because of her work and because of the fact that she actually does contribute to getting women's suffrage passed in England in 1918, she's viewed as essentially a national hero, particularly for women in Britain. There were also more militant suffragettes, and this included, for example, Emmeline Pankhurst, one of these bourgeois suffragettes who came from the middle class, and she lived until 1928, but she was infuriated that Parliament would not give females the vote, even though women in Finland gained this right in 1906 and Norway in 1913. So of the European nations, only 2 of them had adopted women's suffrage prior to the start of World War I in 1914. Along with her daughter, Emmeline Pankhurst founded what became known as the Women's Social and Political Union. I don't know if this makes any sense or not. So the last one that we were talking about, I don't know how much you need to remember this, but the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, NUWSS, all right, is the suffragist organization. The suffragette organization is the Women's Social and Political Union. Think of suffragettes as being more aggressive, and the thing is WSPU, kind of like, it almost looks a little bit like the word wasp, and wasps are more aggressive, so if that helps you to remember it, that's just an easy trick to remember that that's the one that's more militant. Beginning in 1907, the WSPU undertook violent activities such as destroying railroad stations, works of art, and store windows, even chaining themselves to the gates in front of Parliament. And they also organized a number of parades and demonstrations. A number of female militants ended up actually getting arrested for their activities. Some, when they were arrested and put in jail, went on hunger strikes in prison and were force-fed by authorities. Others, perhaps the most notorious example of suffragettes, is when a woman by the name of Emily Davison committed suicide by throwing herself in front of the king's horse in the 1913 Epsom Derby. And so this was a huge deal. It was a very visible event, and it was all over the newspapers and everything. And she literally gave her life for the cause of bringing more attention to women's suffrage. I mean, it's a pretty unbelievable act. And here she is. You can see her laying there as the horse raced by. She ran in front of it. The jockey got knocked off, and she ended up being killed in this horse incident. Davison was attempting to draw attention to the women's suffrage movement, and the act was part of a range of both direct and indirect action by the women's suffragette movement that often broke the law in an attempt to put forward their case. Now, you know, one of the things to keep in mind in these days in the early 1900s, I don't know if you guys have ever seen this movie. It's several years old now, but it's called, oh God, what's the name of Changeling? Has anyone ever seen the movie Changeling? Okay, so the movie Changeling it has Angelina Jolie in it, and it actually is rather uniquely pertinent to Eastvale, because the movie is about a series of murders that took place in the early 19th century that happened not far from here. They were called the Chicken Coop Murders. Have you heard of this before? Yeah. They happened over on Wineville Road, if you know where that is, on the other side of the freeway. In the movie, that's really not the point of why I'm telling you about it. In the movie, Angelina Jolie, as a woman who was exercising, she was very vocal. Basically, there was a lot of corruption in the LAPD. Her son was kidnapped. They bring her an orphan from out of town, and they say, well, we recovered your son. And she's like, that's not my son. And they're like, no, that is your son. And then when she continues fighting it, because it wasn't her son, then they commit her. And the reason I bring this up is because you have to understand that, first of all, police organizations themselves were incredibly corrupt back in these days. And even though women could be breaking the law as it was written, things could get worse for them in jail if a so-called psychiatrist came in and diagnosed them with some sort of hysteria or something like that, that would completely discredit her character. And so, you know, if she is deemed mad, so to speak, right, if she's deemed insane, then it completely takes away any credibility from their stories. You get me? And so these kinds of things happen very frequently to women who were a little bit too vocal for their own good back in the early 20th century. And so women attempting to break the law could have faced pretty harsh consequences socially in the name of trying to achieve women's suffrage. We talked a little bit about this, but the Representation of the People Act of 1918, as a result of women's critical contributions to the war effort during World War I, Parliament gave females over 30 the right to vote. Now, later, about 10 years later, the age of suffrage for women went down to 21, which made it equal to men. But again, you can see even the hesitance, you know, or unwillingness to accept women as voters on the same level as men when they first pass women's suffrage in England. But fortunately, they kind of get their act together 10 years later and they reform it to make it equal. Okay, so the next section that we're talking about here relating to Britain is dealing with what became known as the Irish question. The Irish question. So, from the perspective of Britain, what do we do with Ireland? There had been a movement in Ireland, a nationalistic movement called the Young Ireland Movement, very similar to Mazzini's Young Italy movement in the Romantic days of the revolutions of 1848. But the Young Ireland movement echoed the same kinds of liberal, nationalistic sentiments that were happening in various places in the revolutions of 1848. And the Irish question was the most recurring and serious problem that Britain faced from 1890 all the way up to the start of World War I in 1914. And William Gladstone, the Prime Minister, Liberal Prime Minister, who we had talked about this morning, pushed very hard but unsuccessfully for Irish Home Rule. In other words, let the Irish people run their own country, manage their own affairs, things like that. Don't treat them like a colony anymore. Ulster, which is the northern region of Ireland, is where the Protestant counties in Northern Ireland were, and they opposed Irish Home Rule because they knew that if Ireland got Home Rule, the North Irish, who had been given special treatment by the British, right? Think of it this way: you've got Ireland, okay? There's a small portion of Northern Ireland that is Protestant. And they received special treatment, special favor from Britain for a long time, while the rest of Ireland basically suffered. The reason that the Northern Irish didn't want Home Rule is because now Ireland is going to control that region, and after years of being treated badly by the Northern Irish, now there's going to be animosity because the Northern Irish, who are Protestant, are going to be the minority who is picked on by the majority of Catholics living in the rest of the country. So this created a century or more of serious problems between Northern Irish and the rest of Ireland. As they started to enjoy remarkable economic growth from the mid-1890s, because Northern Ireland, as I said, benefited from being Protestant and kind of taken under the wing of England. Ulsterites raised 100,000 armed volunteers by 1930, opposing Home Rule. Ulsterites were supported by the British public opinion, and in 1914, eventually, they do pass the Irish Home Rule Act by the House of Commons and Lords, but the Irish Protestants in the North refused to accept it, and the implementation of Home Rule in Ireland was deferred until after World War I was over. There is, though, during World War I, there's a revolt. There's a revolt in Ireland that, because there were many Irish folks who were like, when are we going to finally implement this thing? This thing got passed in 1914. It's 2 years later, nothing's happened. When are we going to get our home rule? And then they have a huge revolt. And that's what this was, Easter Rebellion. For independence, and this was crushed. The Easter Rebellion for independence was crushed by British troops. While World War I was still going on, they're still fighting in the trenches in eastern France, the Western Front as it's called. And in 1922, Ireland finally gained their independence. And when that happened, it was decided at that time that Northern Ireland would not become part of Ireland, but rather stay a part of the British Empire, Great Britain. So Northern Ireland and Ireland didn't end up coalescing into a single state. Okay, the Eastern question is another. So we had the Irish question, now we got the Eastern question. The Eastern question is another one. As the Ottoman Empire, which is also nicknamed the sick man of Europe, we've probably heard that once or twice in here before. As the Ottoman Empire receded, fell back in terms of its boundaries in southeastern Europe, the Balkans, a constant state of crisis existed in the Balkans. Who would control that region? So as the Ottoman Empire's control over the Balkan territories is dwindling, there are these other nationalistic groups that are getting more and more feisty in the Balkans and pushing for sovereignty and self-rule. The two major players, the two major competitors to take control of those regions were going to be Russia and Austria, because those are the two largest empires, and two, They're just to the north of where the Ottoman Empire is. So it's kind of a region in between. If this was all of them, it'd be like Austria-Hungary, Russia, and then Ottoman Empire, and they're kind of fighting over these regions in between them. So Russia's dream from the very get-go, since the reign of Catherine the Great, was to retake the Balkans and ultimately take over Constantinople, which was the capital of the Ottoman Empire. Now it's known as Istanbul, you might know. The old capital of the Byzantine Empire and the cradle of Orthodox Christianity. So the Russians wanted to take over Constantinople. The Austro-Hungarian also had their own designs on trying to take over parts of the region. And then you have this other idea known as Pan-Slavism, which was this idea, the people who live in the Balkans largely are of Slavic descent, okay, Slavic descent. And so this idea of Pan-Slavism was that, you know, all Slavic people would be united under one government in Russia, basically, right? And so Russia's military victory over the Ottoman Empire in 1878 put it in a very good position to dominate the Balkans, take over all those areas, and ultimately create a pan-Slavic state where all Slavic people, regardless if you're Serbian or Bulgarian or whatever, Romanian, anything, all Slavic people would live under the rule of Russia. Now, some people like this idea because the Russians at the time are kind of a developing nation, seemingly have a lot going for them in some respects. Towards the end of the 19th century, Russia is starting to industrialize. They're building railroads and other things like that. Seemingly, there would be an advantage to being taken in by the Russian Empire because they're huge. On the other hand, though, you have a number of people with several nationalistic desires to create their own states and not be controlled by an absolutist foreign leader with Russia. So Britain, when these ideas start coming out there, Britain refused to accept Russian control of the Balkans and ended up sending the Royal Navy over to help the Turks in the Ottoman Empire. And this nationalistic spirit of the British going over to protect the sovereignty of the Balkan region became known as Jingoism. And it came from this quote down here: "We don't want to fight, but by Jingo, if we do, we've got the ships, we've got the men, we've got the money too. The Russians will not take Constantinople." So they're trying to protect Constantinople from being taken over by the Russians. And Jingoism is still a term that you'll sometimes hear used. It's like an SAT term. It just means nationalism, pretty much. Meanwhile, at this time, because this was back in 1878, Bismarck over in Prussia, this is before Bismarck got fired, Bismarck offered to mediate this crisis between Russia and Britain, and the Ottoman Empire. So this became known as the Congress of Berlin, which happens in 1878. Special note on this: the Congress of Berlin is kind of confusing because it's extremely similar to another conference that happened in Berlin called the Berlin Conference. The Congress of Berlin, very deliberate terms, right? The Congress of Berlin was a diplomatic meeting where the British and the Russians and the Turks were meeting to resolve this conflict. The Berlin Conference, on the other hand, happened about 6 years later in 1884. And that one is more important because the Berlin Conference had nothing to do with any of this. The Berlin Conference of 1884, 1885 had to do with colonialism, imperialism. It had to do with Africa, carving up Africa and deciding which European nations are going to take over which places in Africa, which is more important for the grand scheme of things in the class than the Congress of Berlin, which was mediating the Balkan crisis in 1878. So that's what this slide's about. What happens at this conference is rather interesting, though. Russia, despite the fact that they had beaten the Turks, basically got nothing from their victory, which was unique. The provisions after everything was said and done at the Congress of Berlin was that Romania, Montenegro, and Serbia, which are all in the Balkans, would become independent sovereign states. Bulgaria, which is today a country, became an autonomous principality that was still technically part of the Ottoman Empire. And then Austria gained a region known as Bosnia and Herzegovina. Now, this in particular really upset Serbia, okay? There's another state, Serbia, in the Balkans that had been pressing pretty hard for nationalism and self-sovereignty and self-rule and stuff like that. When Austria gained Bosnia and Herzegovina, this was just another example of a place that isn't Austrian, doesn't belong in the Austrian Empire, and they get it, and Serbia immediately objects to it. They also agreed to transfer Cyprus to Great Britain because it's not far from the Suez Canal, which the British were using recently. You guys heard the news about the Suez Canal and the ship being stuck in it? It's been a huge thing recently, the last week or whatever. And then Benjamin Disraeli, who was the prime minister at the time, was most responsible for these agreements. But ironically, Russia blames Bismarck, who had been the one to hold this whole meeting and mediate the process. So even though Benjamin Disraeli was the one that was actually most doggedly against any of these provisions in this war going towards Russia's favor, the Russians don't blame Disraeli, but instead blame Bismarck for his interference in the situation. So here you can see kind of what we're talking about. Serbia's in purple up there. Austria-Hungary gained Bosnia-Herzegovina, which is just to the north there, to the north and to the west. Romania is over there. Bulgaria is right there, which would remain within the Ottoman Empire, but became its own principality. Okay. Socialist movements in the age of mass politics. Basically, this is largely a negative response to industrialism and nationalism. The main goal of these socialist movements at this time is to advance the cause of the working class, the proletariat, throughout all of Europe. And they saw nationalism as a tool used by the ruling classes to divert public attention away from social issues, in particular social issues where the working class is treated in an oppressed fashion. So the other thing about socialist movements at this time is that they're generally opposed to war prior to 1914, since the working class was disproportionately affected by suffering casualties on the front lines. So when you think about if Britain was to fight a war, who do they send in? They send in soldiers. Where do those soldiers come from? The wealthy families or the poor families, right? You know, generally speaking, and this isn't always the case, but the people who are most likely to lose their lives in a war are going to be your working class people who are everyday people. If you're the son of a senator, son of a parliamentarian, son of a whoever, okay, you're not going to probably die on the front lines because you got money, you can get yourself into a position where it's safer and less likely to cost you your life. So the socialists of this time, who of course are protecting and advocating for the working class, are typically anti-war. Marxism definitely led the negative response to industrialization. Remember that Karl Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto, and the Communist Manifesto called for the overthrow of the bourgeoisie, the middle class, right? In the name of creating a society, an egalitarian society where everybody is equal, shares equally in the wealth, and uses wealth according to their need. Essentially a so-called utopia, right? Unfortunately for Marx, his teachings end up getting kind of changed around, revised, as the decades wane on, because as time goes on, it becomes clear that democracy is starting to spread around, and the idea of a radical, violent war between the classes became less appealing. And so the socialists of the 1880s and 1890s kind of take on this new form of socialism that calls for political parties, which Marx had previously said would be wiped out when the communist revolution happens and all that sort of stuff. The socialists united for the first time in 1864 to form the First International, and Marx was one of the principal organizers of that. You had the growth of various socialist parties afterwards, after 1871, which was pretty phenomenal, especially in Germany. The Social Democratic Party was largely socialist, and then in France, Belgium, and Austria-Hungary, you also had socialist parties develop. And then in 1883, the socialists get exiled from Russia, and they end up forming the Russian Social Democratic Party in Switzerland, and it grew very rapidly after 1890. And of course, the most famous person involved with that was a guy by the name of Vladimir Lenin. Vladimir Lenin was the Russian communist revolutionary of 1917. He was one of these people to be exiled to Switzerland, in part because his brother attempted to kill the Tsar, I think, or someone like, I don't know, the Tsar's relatives or something like that. But anyway, they exiled Vladimir Lenin to Switzerland. Okay, so when we talk about revisionist Marxism, that this whole slide's about that. Basically, as workers gained the right to vote, the level of interest they had in waging some sort of violent warfare went down. So as workers gained the right to vote and to participate politically in the nation state, their attention focused more on elections than on revolutions. And that was one of the things that Marx likely would not have been able to predict when he wrote the Communist Manifesto in 1848. Workers' standard of living also rose gradually, but then substantially after 1850. And so because the working class people, we've talked about ways in which Britain, France, Germany started making reforms to clean the cities up, make the cities safer, improve transportation, improve wages, those kinds of things. As conditions for workers in Britain, France, and other places, as they improved, people didn't feel as hostile anymore because now they've got a better quality of life, right? So they don't want to go out and revolt and cause a bunch of problems and potentially get killed or arrested. So we basically see here that that the idea behind socialism at this time turns away from violent revolution and towards political parties and elections. The growth of labor unions also reinforced the trend towards modernization, since governments accepted labor unions by this point, and so labor unions had a whole lot of ability to, what's the word that I'm looking for? They had a whole lot of ability to negotiate better conditions in the workplace. Increasingly, too, unions were focusing on bread and butter issues, things like wages, things like the hours that they're working, the working conditions themselves, rather than the unions previously had been focusing on a lot of like socialist doctrine and trying to get people involved in socialism and wage revolutions and stuff. Increasingly, they're now just focusing on certain bread and butter issues that they know their workers or their members will appreciate. Genuine collective bargaining. What is collective bargaining? So anytime that there's an issue between a group of workers, let's say like you're working as a construction worker, and there's been a bunch of people who are having accidents on the job because the machinery that you're using isn't safe. The workers' union would go to the factory owners or the construction company owners and say, hey, we're using outdated equipment, we need new equipment, our workers are getting injured on the job, this is costing us a fortune, da 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 da. They are then able to negotiate at a table, you know, with the business owner side and the labor union, side, and they come together at a table and they collectively bargain about what are people going to be paid, how many hours are they going to work, when are their breaks going to be, what are the what are the safety precautions they're going to use, and so on and so forth. So, genuine collective bargaining, which was long opposed by socialist intellectuals as a sellout, was officially recognized as actually a desirable thing to do by the German Trade Union Congress in 1899, after a series of strikes proved effective in gaining concessions from employers. And we talked a little bit about strikes this morning and how effective they can be in pressuring business owners to change their ways. France, Jean Jaurès formally repudiated revisionist doctrines in order to establish a unified socialist party, but basically at heart and in practice, he remained a revisionist, even though outwardly he said he didn't like revisionism. Edward Bernstein was part of the movement of this time as well. He had a book that he wrote in 1899 called Evolutionary Socialism. It was the most prominent of the socialist, he was the most prominent of the socialist revisionists of his time. And he basically argued that Marx's predictions of ever greater poverty for workers and ever greater concentration of wealth in the hands of fewer people, of the wealthy, proved false. Basically, he said Marx made this prediction that as time would go on, more wealth would accrue in the hands of a fewer number of people, and more workers would be in greater poverty. This is a difficult thing. The truth of the matter is that globally, Marx isn't necessarily wrong. If you look at globally where wealth is concentrated, it's concentrated in a few different places, and then you have a whole lot of other people across the planet who have virtually nothing, right? And so, in light of these kinds of things, we need to be aware of, like, are we talking about social discrepancies between a single nation, or are we talking about it globally? And if we're talking globally, I would say that there has been ever greater concentration in the hands of fewer people as a tremendous number of people globally suffer. However, here in the United States and in other Western nations where we're already pretty well off, here in the United States, you may only make $50,000 or $60,000 a year, but globally you're in the top 10%, 12% of income earners, and as a result of that, you don't see as many drives for violent socialism in modern day times, because people's quality of life, even when you're relatively poor in the United States, is still better than a lot of other people's quality of life globally, right? So there's not as much to complain about. The impact of socialism on European politics became profound by the late 19th century. Germany had the Social Democratic Party, the SPD, which was Marxist in philosophy. It advocated for sweeping social legislation, the realization of genuine democracy, and also the demilitarization of the German government. That, of course, was never going to happen. Bismarck instituted sweeping reforms to minimize the political threat from the left. And in 1879, they passed a protective tariff to benefit domestic production, and modern Social Security laws, and national sickness and accident insurance, and old age pensions and retirement benefits. And they began regulating child labor to make it so that you couldn't just put kids in mines and stuff. And then they improved working conditions. And by 1912, the Social Democratic Party became the largest party in the Reichstag. But you can see the kinds of pressure that they're putting on Bismarck to institute these reforms to try to improve the quality of life for German workers. Interestingly enough, of course, Bismarck had no real love for the SPD. He hated them and tried to get rid of them unsuccessfully. And even though he passed all of these reforms, he still remained viewed as essentially a threat to the working class and to democracy by the SPD. Okay, in France, of course, we talked about the socialists who were led by Jean Jaurès, who gained seats in the Chamber of Deputies all the way from 1905 to 1914. This is one of the interesting things about the age of mass politics, is that when people first began to get the right to vote in Europe, there was a pretty significant movement of people who went into the socialist side of things. They went into the Socialist Party. These days, we look at socialism as being pretty extremist here in the United States, pretty radical, right? And it would be a really hard sell because of what, the connotations surrounding socialism are. But in the early days of democracy in Europe, it was viewed as more or less as legitimate as any other political party, and in fact, did gain seats in the parliaments of various places. So England, the Fabian Society of 1883, advanced their form of a revisionist form of Marxism. And then in Britain, of course, we talked this morning about how Keir Hardie led the Independent Labour Party, which became that vocal third party. Okay, we talked about some of this stuff. Okay, anarchism. There is one other even more radical political position than communism, and it is anarchism, which basically means absence of government, okay, like get rid of the government completely. Anarchy literally means without government. So anarchists spun off from the mainstream socialist movement. They sought to destroy the centralized state. One of the better known anarchists of this time was a guy named Mikhail Bakunin, who ends up being executed. His life was cut short. I believe he was executed, at least. I might be mistaking it with somebody else. But a Russian nobleman who became the most influential of the anarchists. But anarchy was most prominent in Spain and Italy, particularly Spain. Political assassinations by anarchists took the world by storm, with the deaths of 6 national leaders between 1881 and 1901. So 6 different people, national figures, were assassinated in that 20-year time span. And of course, these assassinations, these political assassinations, rattle people. They upset people, and as a result of that, anarchism doesn't ever really get off the ground because they're seen as causing chaos. So who was assassinated? Notably, Alexander II, the Tsar of Russia, was assassinated in 1881. King Umberto I of Italy in 1900. President William McKinley of the United States was assassinated in 1901, among the best known of the political assassinations of that time. You can still go to the place in Russia, and I've been there, it's in St. Petersburg, where Alexander II was assassinated. And basically he was in a carriage which exploded by somebody throwing a bomb underneath it, basically, and killed him. So, and it's just outside the church. I can never remember the name of this church, but it's this really beautiful church. You've probably seen it before in pictures. It's not the one from Moscow, but it's in St. Petersburg. It's well known. Okay, Zionism. Zionism is basically the Jewish nationalist movement, put simply. Jewish folks in particularly Eastern Europe, but really all over the place, had been persecuted for a long, long time. They'd been treated really, really badly. And so this discrimination against Jewish folks led some Jewish leaders to call for the creation of a new Jewish state in Palestine. And this state would be known as Israel. Now, today, of course, Israel is a nation state. It's been a nation state since 1946, 49, somewhere in that region. And the leader of the Zionist movement was this guy by the name of Theodor Herzl, who founded the movement in 1897. And he had witnessed anti-Semitism, which is just anti-Jewish activity, in Austria-Hungary firsthand. And he followed very closely the Jewish persecution against Alfred Dreyfus, the Dreyfus affair that happened in France that we talked about the week before break. And then, of course, pogroms in Russia were continuing, where regularly Jews were exposed to violence by hostile Russians. In the 1917 Balfour Declaration, something that might not seem that important on this PowerPoint, but probably one of the more important things that you should know about. You guys in here, you guys ever heard of the conflict between Israel and Palestine? Never heard of it. So here's the deal. That surprises me, actually, but it's good to know about this, right? So, put simply, there was a region around the Sinai Peninsula in the Middle East that was called Palestine. It's still there, I guess, technically, but Palestine never ends up getting recognized as a nation state. Palestine is a region where Palestinians live. They are largely Muslim, and they had lived under the rule of the Ottoman Empire for a long time. The British, with this declaration, the Balfour Declaration of 1917, basically said Jewish people ought to have their homeland carved out of Palestine and made into a state, okay? Now, you might be thinking, how nice of Britain to be looking out for Jewish people, right? Not really. The reality of the situation is that the British, just like the Austro-Hungarians and the Russians and so on, really didn't want Jewish people living in Britain, okay? This is a nationalistic move that they're doing here. They're trying to get rid of Jewish people in England by saying, well, if you had your own state over there, you'd have somewhere to go other than here. Does that make sense to you? All right? So this takes a while to form, but the problem is that the area that gets developed to create Israel, people already lived there and had been living there for 1,000 years. So now, after the Balfour Declaration throughout the 1920s, 30s, and then especially in the 1940s after World War II ends, you have this huge exodus of Jewish folks from Europe, all over Europe, Eastern Europe, Western Europe, all over, moving away from Europe down to Palestine. And they systematically start pushing the Palestinians off the land and saying, this is our land now. Eventually culminating in Israel being made into a nation state after World War II. Mistakenly, a lot of people say, oh, well, the problems between the Israelis and the Palestinians have been going on for thousands of years. Not really. There were no problems between Jewish folks and Palestinians, really, until about 100 years ago. But the other side of this is that in modern day perspective, and this reason why I'm taking time to explain this to you, is because Israel is an ally of the United States and of Britain and of France and of everywhere in Western Europe, whereas a lot of the rest of the Middle East has been largely kind of, if not demonized by the media, less close in terms of international relations to America and the West than Israel is. Israel also happens to be the only nuclear power nation in all of the Middle East there, essentially, outside of maybe Iran now. But generally speaking, Israel has kind of been, Israel is very, very productive. There's no question that Israel has a whole lot going for it. It's very beautiful, and it's a holy site for many people, and so on and so forth. The problem is that you still have a lot of Palestinian people living in and around the areas in Israel who are now being, for example, walled into communities, and there's, Israeli military walking around and these kinds of things. It's an ugly situation in some ways over there, and it doesn't have any real easy solutions because both of the people say this is my homeland, but they don't get along with one another. And both of them have deeply rooted resentment towards one another. So that's something to keep in mind. But anyhow, it all started basically with this Balfour Declaration. Okay, I'm going to, what time do we get out of here today? Let me check the clock. 57? Okay, so I got about 5 more minutes here. All right, let me put this back up real quick. Oh, well, I guess that's that. All right, folks. Well, thank you so much. I hope you have a wonderful day. See you next time, everybody. I put a new reading guide up, by the way. Okay, have a good day.